On my 70th birthday, I asked my son to have dinner with me. He told me he was entirely too busy with a corporate merger, so I went to the steakhouse by myself. When I arrived, I found him sitting at the center table drinking imported champagne with his wife and her mother. What I did next left the entire restaurant in absolute shock. I am William, 70 years old, and the man who spent a lifetime building an empire in absolute silence. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an ungrateful child the true cost of disrespect. I stood in the center of my modest kitchen, wearing my best custom-tailored navy suit. The heavy wool fabric felt foreign against my skin, but necessary for a man turning 70. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone ring 4 times before the line clicked open. The background noise was muffled, but David sounded breathless and deeply irritated by the interruption. I kept my voice steady and asked him if he could spare an hour for a simple steak dinner to celebrate my milestone. His response came fast and sharp like a physical blow. He claimed he was locked in a high-stakes corporate merger meeting and could not possibly leave the office. He said millions of dollars were on the line, his partners were waiting, and he did not have time for trivial social calls right now. He told me to celebrate by myself and that he would call me next week when his schedule cleared up. The line went dead immediately. He did not say goodbye. He certainly did not wish me a happy birthday. I lowered the phone slowly. The silence in my kitchen was absolute and heavy. I did not yell. I did not throw the phone against the wall. Anger is a useless emotion when absolute clarity is required. I placed the device carefully on the granite counter and smoothed the lapels of my suit. I looked down at my hands resting on the countertop. The skin was rough, mapped with deep calluses, dark sunspots, and old scars that expensive tailored wool could never hide. Those hands had spent 40 years gripping the burning steel controls of heavy cranes and pouring concrete foundations beneath the brutal sun. I built my life during a time when a black man with ambition faced locked doors, overt hostility, and systemic barriers at every single turn. I broke those doors down with brute force and relentless labor. I swallowed my pride, endured the racial slights from bankers, and operated heavy machinery until my joints ached, so David would never have to lift anything heavier than a fountain pen. I built an ironclad foundation of wealth entirely in the shadows, ensuring my son could walk into elite corporate boardrooms wearing imported silk ties and Italian leather shoes. I wanted him to learn the value of $1 without suffering the crushing indignity of poverty. I shielded him completely from the grit of my world. Looking at the dark screen of my phone, I realized my fierce protection had created a predator. He viewed my humility as weakness. He saw my modest suburban lifestyle as a direct embarrassment to his curated corporate image. He measured human worth strictly by the balance in a checking account and the designer label on a jacket. My birthday was not going to be defined by his cruel absence. I grabbed my truck keys from the hook by the door. The engine of my 10-year-old truck roared to life with a familiar, reliable grit. I drove through the quiet suburban streets toward the glowing skyline of the downtown financial district. The transition from my modest, quiet neighborhood to the towering glass structures of the city center was a drive I had made thousands of times in secret to check on my commercial properties. Tonight, I was making it just for a decent piece of steak. I pulled up to the valet stand of the most exclusive and notoriously expensive restaurant in the city. Luxury sedans and imported European sports cars lined the illuminated entrance. The young valet approached my truck with a visible sneer. He glanced at the faded gray paint and the dented rear bumpers before looking at my tailored suit with profound confusion. He extended his hand for the keys with a barely concealed sigh of intense condescension. I handed them over without a single word of justification. I did not need to explain the immense value of my vehicle or the depth of my hidden pockets to a stranger on the street. I pulled a crisp $50 bill from my money clip and handed it to him. I watched his sneer vanish into instant groveling respect, and I walked through the heavy oak doors of the steakhouse. I refused to let my son's blatant rejection ruin a milestone I had fought tooth and nail to reach. The hostess greeted me with a practiced hollow smile and quickly guided me away from the vibrant center of the dining room. She seated me at a small, dimly lit corner booth near the kitchen doors. It was exactly the kind of table reserved for people dining alone who the establishment wishes to keep safely out of sight. I sat down, adjusted my cuffs, and ignored the slight. I ordered a black coffee and looked across the expansive room to take in the bustling atmosphere. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the wealthy patrons. My eyes scanned the velvet booths and stopped dead. I froze in my seat. Sitting at the largest center table directly under the brightest chandelier was David. He was not in a boardroom. He was not negotiating a stressful corporate merger. He was leaning back in a plush leather chair, laughing loudly, as a waiter poured an expensive vintage of imported champagne into his crystal glass. Sitting to his left was his wife, Heather, adjusting a diamond tennis bracelet and smiling brightly. Sitting directly across from him was Heather's mother, Cynthia, holding up her glass for an enthusiastic toast. My son had looked me in the eye and lied to my face. He had discarded his father on his 70th birthday to finance a lavish evening for his mother-in-law. I stood completely still by the hostess stand, obscured by a decorative partition. My breath caught in my throat, not from anger, but from a sudden, hollow realization. My son had not merely dismissed my birthday. He had actively chosen this exact moment to entertain the people he truly valued. I watched him lean back in his chair, swirling the pale liquid in his flute. He looked relaxed, completely unburdened by the lie he had just delivered to me. He had traded his father's milestone to finance a lavish evening for his mother-in-law. I did not march over to the table. I did not demand an explanation. Decades of negotiating hostile construction contracts had taught me that immediate confrontation only gives the enemy time to construct better lies. I requested a quiet table nearby and ordered a single black coffee. I sat in the shadows of the restaurant, observing the man I had raised. The laughter floating over from their table was loud and entirely genuine. David raised his glass, offering a toast to Cynthia. She accepted it with a practiced, arrogant smile, adjusting a diamond necklace that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. I sipped my bitter coffee and let the reality of the situation settle into my bones. The boy I had protected from the harshness of the world was now eagerly demonstrating how little that protection meant. Their table was close enough that the ambient noise of the restaurant could not mask their voices. The acoustics of the room seemed perfectly designed to deliver their betrayal directly to me. I heard Cynthia's shrill, commanding tone slice through the clatter of silverware. She leaned forward loudly, praising David for securing the financing on her new luxury condominium. She spoke of the panoramic city views and the imported Italian marble countertops. Her gratitude was dripping with entitlement, a clear acknowledgement of a transaction rather than genuine affection. Heather chimed in immediately, her voice carrying that familiar, piercing note of perpetual dissatisfaction. She complained about the inconvenience of driving out to my suburb. She described my house, the home where I had raised David, the home where my late wife had spent her final days, as a sprawling, outdated eyesore. Heather declared that my continued presence in that neighborhood was a complete embarrassment to their rising social status. She argued that a man my age had no business occupying prime real estate while they were trying to build a modern corporate image. They discussed my life as if I were a piece of derelict machinery waiting to be scrapped. I listened, my face entirely expressionless, as they casually debated the swift disposal of my existence over plates of seared filet. David did not defend me. He did not ask his wife to show a shred of respect for the man who had funded his college education. Instead, he smiled reassuringly and placed a comforting hand over Heather's. His next words turned my blood to absolute ice. He told them not to worry about the suburban property. He casually mentioned that he had already consulted with a legal associate. He explicitly confirmed that a medical power of attorney was currently being drafted. He promised Heather and Cynthia that he would have me moved to a state-run assisted living facility by the end of the month. He spoke of my institutionalization as if he were discussing a minor corporate restructuring. He assured them that once I was legally incapacitated, they could immediately liquidate the property and use the equity to fund Heather's new boutique venture. The plan was terrifyingly concrete. They were not merely waiting for me to pass away. They were actively plotting to strip away my autonomy, my home, and my dignity while I was still entirely capable. They were conspiring to lock me away in a sterile room so they could harvest the assets I had spent 40 years bleeding for. The profound emotional death occurred in a fraction of a second. The love I held for the boy who used to sit on my shoulders vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating mindset of a man preparing for war. The grief did not break me. It hardened into absolute tactical resolve. I was no longer a disappointed father. I was a man facing an active, hostile takeover of my life. My son was not just ungrateful. He was a predator coordinating with parasites to strip me of everything I owned. I watched David signal for another bottle of champagne, celebrating the impending destruction of his father. I placed my coffee cup down with deliberate precision. The time for silent endurance was officially over. I caught the eye of the head waiter passing my booth. I raised my hand in a subtle, unmistakable command. The waiter approached immediately. The game had fundamentally changed, and I was about to make my first move. The waiter nodded at my signal and turned toward the center of the dining room. I watched him approach the main terminal, collect a thick, black leather billfold, and pivot toward David's table. I stood up. My knees popped slightly, a persistent reminder of 40 years spent climbing steel scaffolding in the freezing rain. But my posture remained perfectly straight. I intercepted the young man behind a wide marble pillar, stepping into his path before he could cross the floor. I held out my hand and calmly demanded the check. The waiter blinked in surprise. He looked at my worn tweed suit and then down at the total printed on the receipt. He hesitated, shifting his weight nervously. He clearly assumed I was a confused elderly patron who had wandered away from the early bird special. He respectfully informed me that the bill belonged to the party at the center table and noted that the total was exceptionally high. He patronizingly suggested I return to my seat. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or offer an explanation for my request. I simply extended my hand an inch further and repeated my command with the absolute authority of a man accustomed to directing crews of hardened steelworkers. The waiter swallowed hard, recognizing the undeniable tone of an order. He handed over the leather folio. I opened it and glanced at the itemized list. 4 bottles of imported champagne, dry-aged steaks, and truffles. The total amounted to more than what I used to earn in 3 months during my 20s. David had spared absolutely no expense to impress his mother-in-law on the exact night he claimed to be suffering through a grueling corporate crisis. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out a solid metal credit card. It was matte black, unembossed, and completely devoid of bank logos. The only text etched across the heavy titanium surface was my name and the corporate entity I commanded, Apex Horizon LLC. I placed the card on top of the receipt and handed the folio back to the waiter. His eyes widened as he felt the physical weight of the metal. He rushed to the nearest terminal to process the transaction. While he waited for the authorization, I looked at the embossed letters on the card. I never told David the truth about my finances. He believed my small, gritty construction company had simply plateaued and provided a modest retirement pension. He had absolutely no idea that decades of quietly buying up undervalued commercial lots and pouring my own concrete had compounded into a massive multi-million-dollar real estate holding conglomerate. I engineered the illusion of my suburban poverty deliberately. I wanted my son to build his own empire. I wanted him to understand the profound weight of a dollar earned through sweat and sacrifice rather than handing him a fortune he never bled for. I remembered the blistering summers operating heavy machinery, in the brutal heat, fighting for every contract against competitors who dismissed me because of the color of my skin. I secured my wealth in the shadows to protect it. I funded his education, but I refused to fund his arrogance. Instead, he used his expensive degree to secure a mid-level executive position at a commercial leasing firm, a firm that, unbeknownst to him, was a subsidiary entirely owned and operated by Apex Horizon LLC. I was not just his father. I was the silent architect of his entire professional existence. The waiter returned with the printed receipt, his previous condescension completely erased and replaced by a terrified, eager respect. The transaction had approved instantly. The trap was now fully loaded and ready to spring. I took the sleek silver pen offered by the waiter and signed my name on the merchant copy with bold, deliberate strokes. I added a highly generous tip, rewarding the young man for his prompt discretion. I handed the leather billfold back to him and delivered my final instructions. I told him to carry this receipt directly to the gentleman sitting at the center table. I explicitly ordered him not to say another word about the bill. He was simply to place the itemized receipt and the merchant copy directly in front of David and inform him that the gentleman sitting alone in the corner booth had already covered the entire expense for their celebration. The waiter nodded rapidly, understanding the gravity of the request, without needing any further explanation. I did not linger to watch the immediate interaction. I turned my back on the dining room, buttoned my tweed jacket, and exited the restaurant through a discreet side door that led directly to the street. The crisp night air hit my face, clearing the suffocating scent of expensive cologne and roasted meats from my lungs. I walked deliberately down the sidewalk, the rhythmic tap of my leather shoes echoing against the concrete. I positioned myself safely across the street, standing in the shadows beneath a large oak tree. From this vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the restaurant's expansive glass windows. I watched the waiter navigate through the crowded dining room, holding the black leather folio tightly against his chest. He was walking steadily toward the center table, where my son was currently raising another glass of champagne to toast his own fabricated success. The game was in motion. Standing perfectly still in the darkness, I watched the scene unfold through the brightly lit restaurant window. The waiter arrived at the center table. David reached for his wallet with a practiced, arrogant flourish, preparing to impress his wife and mother-in-law. The waiter shook his head politely, refusing the offered credit card. He placed the leather folio directly on the white tablecloth in front of my son. Even from across the street, I could clearly see the waiter gesture respectfully toward the empty corner booth where I had been sitting just moments before. David frowned, utterly confused. He opened the leather billfold to inspect the receipt. I watched his eyes scan the itemized list and stopped dead at the payment confirmation at the bottom. He read the printed corporate signature, Apex Horizon LLC. The physical reaction was immediate and violent. The arrogant smile vanished from his face as if it had been slapped away. The color drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He dropped the receipt onto his plate, his hands beginning to shake visibly. Heather noticed his panic and reached for the paper, but David snatched it back, crushing it in his fist. He realized the absolute catastrophe he had just triggered. The man he had dismissed as a poor, burdensome old fool was the supreme shadow owner of the corporate entity that signed his paychecks, held his commercial leases, and dictated his entire career. David stumbled out of his chair, ignoring the alarmed questions from his wife and Cynthia. He frantically scanned the dining room, desperately searching the empty corner booth for his father. I turned away from the window, walked to my old truck, and drove home in total silence. The heavy oak front door of my house rattled under a frantic series of knocks at exactly 7 o'clock the next morning. I had been awake since 4, sitting in the dark of my kitchen, with a cup of black coffee waiting for the inevitable fallout. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. David stood on my porch, shivering slightly in the crisp morning air. He held a small plastic container housing a single grocery store cupcake, with a garish plastic ring stuck into the neon blue frosting. His designer suit looked rumpled, and the dark circles under his eyes betrayed a completely sleepless night. He forced a wide, unnatural smile that did not reach his panicked eyes. He immediately launched into a rehearsed speech, speaking entirely too fast. He claimed his corporate merger meeting had wrapped up unexpectedly early the previous night. He insisted he had driven straight over this morning because he could not bear the thought of letting his father's 70th birthday pass without a proper celebration. He thrust the cheap cupcake toward my chest like a peace offering. It was a pathetic, insulting performance. The boy I had raised to face reality with a straight spine was standing on my property, drowning in his own cowardice. I looked at the $5 pastry, then up at the son who had just spent thousands of my dollars on imported champagne for his mother-in-law. I did not slam the door in his face. I did not confront him about the restaurant receipt. I stepped aside, opening the door wider to invite the predator into my home. I needed to see exactly how far his desperation would push him. I accepted the plastic container with trembling, exaggerated gratitude, playing the role of the lonely, oblivious old man to absolute perfection. I shuffled toward the kitchen counter, ensuring my steps looked heavier and more uncertain than usual. I invited David to sit at the island and offered to pour him a cup of fresh coffee. He accepted quickly, sliding onto the bar stool. I turned my back to him, reaching for the ceramic mugs, but my kitchen features a polished, reflective backsplash. In the reflection of the dark tiles, I watched my son. He was not looking at me. His eyes darted frantically around the room, eventually locking onto the heavy mahogany door of my private study down the hall. He was sweating. He drummed his fingers against the granite countertop in a rapid, uncontrolled rhythm. He needed to know if I was truly the man who paid his restaurant bill, or if it was some bizarre cosmic coincidence. He needed to know if the Apex Horizon corporate entity had finally breached the walls of his comfortable suburban deception. I turned around and slid the hot mug toward him. My hands were perfectly steady. David wrapped his palms around the ceramic, clearing his throat. He asked me how I spent my evening, his voice tight and overly casual. He probed gently, inquiring if I had gone out or spoken to anyone from the old construction days. I offered him a warm, vacant smile. I told him I had simply fallen asleep in my armchair, watching a baseball game. I watched the tension momentarily drain from his shoulders, only to be instantly replaced by a deep, predatory calculation. If I was still just a harmless, ignorant retiree, his plan to institutionalize me could proceed without friction. He took a sip of the scalding coffee and grimaced, his mind clearly racing to formulate a strategy to access my study. David placed the mug down abruptly and stood up. He manufactured a clumsy, sudden excuse about an upset stomach from his supposed late-night meeting, asking to use the guest bathroom down the hall. I waved him off with a sympathetic nod and turned back to the sink to wash my coffee pot. The guest bathroom is located directly across from my private study. I stood perfectly still in the kitchen, listening to the distinct sound of his leather shoes on the hardwood floor. The footsteps did not stop at the bathroom door. They drifted slightly further down the corridor, stopping precisely in front of the study. I heard the faint metallic click of his hand testing the brass doorknob. It was locked, of course. I smiled coldly to myself, wiping my calloused hands on a cotton dish towel. David was foolish enough to believe I would leave the master ledgers of a multi-million-dollar real estate conglomerate sitting in an unlocked desk drawer in a quiet suburb. 5 years ago, when I first noticed the relentless entitlement creeping into his lifestyle, I moved every physical corporate deed, every secondary trust document, and every financial ledger to a highly secure biometric safe deposit box in the city center. The only things resting inside that study were old architectural blueprints and dusty historical novels. My son was risking a direct confrontation to conduct sloppy amateur espionage for documents he would never find. He rattled the doorknob twice more, sheer desperation, making him entirely careless. He was frantically searching for physical proof of my wealth, searching for the master key to Apex Horizon LLC, completely unaware that he was already trapped inside my vault. Less than 3 minutes later, David rushed back into the kitchen. His breathing was shallow, and his face was flushed with the frantic adrenaline of a thief nearly caught in the act. He did not sit back down. He grabbed his expensive coat from the back of the stool and began rapidly firing off excuses about an emergency email from his firm, requiring his immediate physical attention. He promised we would have a proper dinner this upcoming weekend, throwing the empty words over his shoulder as he practically ran toward the front door. I simply nodded from the kitchen counter, telling him to drive safely. The heavy oak door slammed shut, vibrating the walls of the entry path. I listened to his car engine roar to life and speed away. I walked slowly out of the kitchen and into the main hallway. The morning sun slanted through the glass panels, illuminating the hardwood floor just outside my study door. Resting against the wooden baseboard, dropped from David's trembling hands in his sheer panic to escape the corridor, was a folded piece of crisp white paper. I bent down my knees, protesting slightly, and picked it up. It was printed on thick official letterhead from a private medical clinic in the city. I unfolded the document and began to read the typed text. The blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. It was a preliminary psychiatric evaluation bearing my full legal name. The document outlined a severe and rapid cognitive decline, detailing completely fabricated instances of severe memory loss and violent, erratic outbursts. At the bottom of the page rested a forged signature from a corrupt medical officer formally recommending my immediate involuntary commitment to a state-run assisted living facility. The threat was no longer just a dinner table conversation. The legal execution of my imprisonment had already begun. I did not waste time calling David to demand an explanation. Explanations are just the lies people tell when they are caught in an indefensible position. I walked straight to my truck and drove directly to the downtown corporate offices of Apex Horizon LLC. Marcus Hayes was my chief corporate attorney, and a man carved from the exact same unforgiving stone that I was. We had fought side by side in the trenches of vicious zoning wars and hostile corporate takeovers for 3 decades. He knew the sheer grit it took to build my empire, and he protected it with the ferocity of a guard dog. I bypassed his receptionist and walked straight into his corner office. I did not offer a morning greeting. I simply placed the folded psychiatric evaluation perfectly flat on his polished mahogany desk. Hayes paused his typing and picked up the document. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the forged medical letterhead, the fabricated instances of my supposed violent dementia, and the corrupt doctor's signature at the bottom of the page. I stood by the window looking out over the expansive city skyline we had helped construct, waiting for his professional assessment. I watched Hayes's expression shift from professional curiosity to lethal, quiet outrage. He recognized the name of the clinic immediately. He knew the signature belonged to a physician currently under investigation for insurance fraud. Hayes set the paper down and looked up at me. He did not offer useless sympathy. He understood exactly what this piece of paper represented. It was a formal declaration of war from my own flesh and blood. David was preparing to execute a legal assassination to strip me of my assets and my freedom. Hayes reached for his telephone and instructed his entire legal team to clear their schedules for the rest of the week. Hayes bypassed standard legal protocols and immediately initiated a full forensic audit of David's recent financial authorizations. We ignored the primary corporate ledgers entirely. David knew those accounts were heavily monitored by my board of directors and completely untouchable. A thief always looks for the softest target the door left unlocked by blind trust. Hayes bypassed the public holding accounts and dug directly into the secondary family trust. I established this specific fund 15 years ago, shortly after my wife Sarah passed away. She had always been the beating heart of our family, the woman who packed my lunch when I was pouring concrete for minimum wage and never once complained about the dust on my work boots. I built that memorial trust specifically to honor her legacy. The primary directive of the fund was to completely secure the financial future of our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I gave David limited authorization over this account, strictly to manage its basic philanthropic distributions, trusting him to act as the honorable guardian of his mother's memory. It was the single greatest error in judgment I have ever made. Hayes's fingers flew across his keyboard, pulling up deeply buried transaction histories and routing numbers that David believed were safely hidden behind digital firewalls. The encrypted screen illuminated the dark office with a harsh, glaring truth. We did not just find a few misplaced expenses or poor investments. We found a systematic, highly organized bleed. David had deliberately rerouted the trust's safety protocols to mask his withdrawals. The secondary family trust was designed to be an impenetrable financial fortress, and my son had spent the last 3 years quietly dismantling it from the inside out. Hayes isolated the transaction dates, cross-referencing the outbound wire transfers with David's personal banking activity. The numbers scrolling across the monitor were staggering. My son had not just stolen money. He had violated the sacred memory of the woman who gave him life, treating her memorial fund as his own personal slush fund. The audit quickly revealed a massive, undeniable web of deceit. David had been siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from the Memorial Trust in structured, calculated increments to avoid triggering automatic bank alerts. Hayes mapped the ultimate destination of every stolen dollar. The imported champagne and aged steaks from the previous night were completely insignificant compared to the true scope of his theft. The financial mapping showed a massive wire transfer executed exactly 6 months ago. David had used his mother's memorial funds to purchase Cynthia's luxury downtown condominium entirely in cash. He had bought his mother-in-law's silence and adoration, using the money strictly meant for his unborn children. The revelations did not stop there. Hayes traced a continuous monthly hemorrhaging of capital directed toward a failing commercial address in the upscale shopping district. It was Heather's luxury designer boutique. The business was a complete financial disaster, generating absolutely no profit and operating entirely in the red. Heather spent her days playing the role of a successful elite entrepreneur while bleeding capital at an unsustainable rate. David had been artificially floating her failing vanity project using the stolen trust funds. He kept the boutique doors open solely to maintain their fragile social standing among the city's wealthy elite. They were living a complete lie, projecting an image of extreme wealth entirely subsidized by outright theft. They ruthlessly mocked my suburban home and my simple lifestyle while secretly draining the very foundation I had built for them. David had traded his family's legacy to finance the arrogant delusions of his wife and mother-in-law. The true danger of the situation materialized when Hayes accessed the county clerk's digital filing system to check for any pending legal actions bearing my name. He found a digital footprint that made my blood run entirely cold. David had not merely drafted the forged medical power of attorney as an empty threat. He had already scheduled the documents to be legally filed and executed by a corrupt clerk. The system showed the specific, undeniable timestamp. The institutionalization order was set to become legally binding by Friday at exactly noon. If that document processed, David would instantly gain full, unchecked legal authority over my physical person and every single asset tied to my public name. The state would physically remove me from my home under a mandatory psychiatric hold, and David would have absolute freedom to liquidate the suburban property before I could ever secure a lawyer to fight back from inside a locked ward. I looked at the heavy brass clock sitting on Hayes's desk. It was Wednesday morning. We had exactly 48 hours. 48 hours to completely dismantle David's life before he could seize control of my estate and lock me away. The timeline was brutally tight, but I had spent my entire life working under extreme pressure. I looked at Hayes. The shock and the grief were completely gone, replaced entirely by the cold, mechanical precision of a demolition project. I told my attorney that we were not going to file a simple police report or sue him in civil court. A lawsuit gives the enemy time to breathe, hide assets, and counterattack. I wanted to cut the oxygen lines to his entire existence immediately. I authorized Hayes to begin the immediate silent destruction of David's financial infrastructure. The adjustment was going to be completely ruthless. I sat across from Hayes, the heavy silence of the office pressing against the glass windows. Most fathers would have driven straight to their son's office to scream demand answers or throw punches. A shouting match achieves absolutely nothing. It gives the enemy an opportunity to play the victim, to formulate lies, and to hide their remaining assets. I refused to grant David the luxury of a warning. I leaned forward and instructed Hayes to initiate a complete and absolute destruction of David's financial oxygen. I wanted every single tether severed with absolute silence. David believed he held all the cards because I played the role of the humble retired construction worker. He was about to find out that the man who built an empire in the shadows knows exactly how to dismantle one in the dark. Hayes nodded, his expression devoid of pity. He immediately began drafting the severance documents. We were not merely going to freeze accounts. We were going to systematically remove the ground from beneath their feet before they even realized they were falling. Hayes printed the initial stack of legal directives. The printer hummed methodically, churning out the paperwork that would permanently detach David from the immense wealth of Apex Horizon LLC. I watched the crisp white pages pile up. Every page represented a brick removed from the false fortress my son had constructed. I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. The grief was entirely gone, replaced by the precise mechanical rhythm of a demolition project. I picked up the solid gold pen resting on Hayes's desk. It was time to start signing away my son's stolen kingdom. Hayes slid the first heavy stack of legal deeds across the polished mahogany surface. These were not simple eviction notices. They were structural reassignments. I pressed the gold pen to the paper and signed my full legal name, instantly transferring the absolute ownership of the high-end commercial property housing Heather's luxury boutique. I moved the entire asset directly into a blind, irrevocable trust entirely outside of David's reach. Heather believed she was a brilliant, self-made entrepreneur dominating the city's fashion scene. She had no idea that her entire business was housed inside a building owned outright by her father-in-law. My signature legally dissolved her false reality. I flipped to the next thick document. This deed governed the title to the upscale downtown condominium where Cynthia currently lived. David had used my late wife's memorial funds to purchase that property in cash, guaranteeing his mother-in-law a life of unearned luxury. I signed the transfer papers with heavy, deliberate strokes. Cynthia's permanent residence was now legally absorbed into the new blind trust. She went from being a proud, wealthy homeowner to an unauthorized tenant residing in a corporate-owned property in less than 10 seconds. Finally, Hayes presented the corporate banking mandates. These were the most crucial documents on the desk. I systematically revoked David's signature authority across every single tier of Apex Horizon LLC. I legally stripped him of his executive access, his expense accounts, and his ability to authorize any future financial transactions. He could no longer move a single penny without triggering an immediate hard lock on the system. The transfer of assets was complete. I had effectively vaporized millions of dollars of their accessible wealth without making a single phone call or raising my voice. David, Heather, and Cynthia were currently walking around the city, completely broke, entirely unaware that their lavish lifestyle had just been legally pronounced dead. I placed the pen back onto the desk. Legal documents only carry weight when backed by immediate physical enforcement. I instructed Hayes to contact our preferred private security contractors. I authorized a specialized team to descend upon Heather's boutique exactly at midnight. They were ordered to drill out the deadbolts, change every exterior lock, and secure the perimeter before the morning staff arrived. Heather would show up to open her prestigious vanity project, only to find herself permanently locked out on the sidewalk. I wanted the transition to be brutal and absolute. Next, I ordered Hayes to draft a formal, immediate eviction notice for Cynthia. She had grown entirely too comfortable sleeping in a luxury high-rise funded by my late wife's stolen memorial money. The 30-day notice was to be processed and certified for immediate delivery. We executed these moves with surgical, terrifying silence. No warning emails were sent. No angry voicemails were left. David was currently sitting in his office, pretending to manage corporate mergers, entirely oblivious to the rapid deployment of my security teams across the city. The element of surprise is the most devastating weapon in any conflict. If David wanted to play the role of a ruthless corporate shark by drafting fake psychiatric holds, he was about to learn how a true apex predator operates. I stood up from the leather chair and gathered the copies of my newly signed directives. I thanked Hayes for his ruthless efficiency. The physical locks were changing, the properties were shifting, and the trap was perfectly set. I walked out of the downtown office and drove back to my large suburban home to wait for the inevitable collision. I sat behind the heavy oak desk in my private locked study. The late afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across the room. I was carefully reviewing the final printed copies of the irrevocable trust paperwork. The quiet stillness of the house was suddenly broken by the sharp, persistent vibration of my phone resting on the desk. I glanced at the glowing screen. It was an automated notification from a social media application I kept strictly to monitor the family's public behavior. I tapped the screen and opened the alert. A new video began to play immediately. Heather was standing in the bright sunlight of a high-end dealership lot. She was wearing designer sunglasses and holding a massive pair of keys. Behind her sat a brand-new custom-ordered luxury sports car. The vehicle easily cost more than $100,000. Heather was laughing into the camera, loudly bragging to her followers about her incredible new purchase and praising David for being the ultimate provider. She was flaunting a machine purchased entirely with the last remaining funds siphoned from my late wife's memorial trust. The sheer breathtaking audacity of the video extinguished any lingering trace of paternal hesitation I might have harbored. They were actively celebrating their theft, while my forged psychiatric evaluation sat waiting to be filed. I picked up the phone and bypassed the video. I dialed Hayes directly on his private line. He answered on the first ring. I did not bother with a greeting. I told my attorney that the grace period was officially over. I authorized him to drop the hammer and freeze every single remaining account tied to David's name immediately. The silent severance was finished. The loud destruction was about to begin. Through the secure live feed routed to my study monitor by my private security contractors, I watched the scene unfold exactly as I had predicted. The scent of polished Italian leather and bespoke perfume practically radiated through the screen from the city's most exclusive designer boutique. Heather navigated the pristine showroom floor with the entitlement of a reigning monarch. Cynthia trailed closely behind her, pointing a manicured finger at silk scarves, while a pair of highly stressed sales associates scurried to gather their selections. They treated the staff with absolute, undisguised contempt. Heather did not look at price tags. She demanded a limited edition crocodile leather tote, 2 cashmere trench coats, and a pair of diamond-encrusted heels that required a special display case to be unlocked. She piled her selections onto the polished glass counter with a theatrical sigh of exhaustion. The lead associate, maintaining a strained, professional smile, tallied the mountain of merchandise. The final total flashed on the sleek digital register, surpassing $20,000. Heather barely glanced at the screen. She reached into her designer purse and withdrew her primary platinum credit card. She tossed the heavy plastic onto the glass counter without making eye contact with the cashier. She began complaining loudly to Cynthia about the unbearable traffic they would face on their way to the country club. She expected the transaction to be a mere formality. She expected the staff to bow their heads and hand over the shopping bags. She was completely unaware that the financial ground beneath her feet had been entirely vaporized by my signature just hours prior. I watched the sales associate pick up the platinum card and slide it through the terminal. The machine processed for 3 agonizing seconds before emitting a sharp negative tone. A stark red message flashed across the cashier's screen. With a highly apologetic tone, the young woman informed Heather that the transaction had been declined. Heather stopped talking mid-sentence. She let out a sharp, condescending laugh, shaking her head as if dealing with an incompetent child. She loudly declared that the machine was obviously broken and instructed the associate to try again. The cashier complied only to receive the exact same rejection. Heather's arrogant smile slipped entirely. She snatched the card back and immediately produced 3 more premium credit cards from her wallet, slapping them onto the glass counter. She ordered the associate to run them all. The young woman swiped the first backup card. Declined. She swiped the second. Declined. She swiped the third. The terminal locked completely, flashing a severe critical fraud block warning. The commotion drew the attention of the boutique manager, a stern woman in a sharp black suit, who had already been briefed by my legal team. The manager stepped behind the counter and reviewed the terminal alerts. Her expression hardened instantly. She looked directly at Heather, dropping her previous subservient warmth. She informed my daughter-in-law that every single financial institution had placed a hard freeze on her accounts due to suspected fraudulent activity. Heather began to shriek, demanding the manager override the system and threatening to have everyone fired. She invoked David's corporate title, screaming that her husband would buy the entire store just to close it down. The manager did not flinch. She firmly instructed Heather and Cynthia to leave the premises immediately or face police intervention. Heather and Cynthia were forced to walk out the front doors completely empty-handed, their faces burning with supreme public humiliation. The audio feed captured Heather standing on the pristine sidewalk outside the boutique, her voice shaking violently. She dialed David's private cellular number, completely ignoring the curious glances of passing pedestrians. When David answered, she bypassed any normal greeting and launched into a completely hysterical tirade. She screamed about the profound embarrassment she had just endured, demanding he fix the banking error instantly. She threatened to file for divorce if her credit lines were not fully restored within the hour. Sitting in his downtown office, David felt the first true wave of terror. I knew his exact routine. He would instruct his wife to calm down and immediately open his secure personal banking portal. He would type his master password, expecting to see a minor technical glitch. Instead, the dashboard would load to reveal absolute ruin. His primary checking account did not display a low balance. It displayed a massive negative figure. I had ensured that every single screen displayed the exact same stark flashing red notification. His assets were completely frozen under an emergency corporate mandate. At the very bottom of the page, a terrifying legal notice was pinned to his profile. It stated that all accessible funds were currently seized, pending an active federal embezzlement and corporate fraud investigation authorized by Apex Horizon LLC. David was staring at his glowing monitor, the air trapped in his lungs. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the force of a falling anvil. He had no cash, no credit, and no financial cover. I had completely annihilated his life with a single silent stroke. Any rational man would have instantly realized the game was lost. A normal son would have driven straight to his father's house, dropped to his knees, and begged for mercy to avoid a federal prison sentence. But I knew David. I knew the monstrous entitlement I had accidentally nurtured. David did not choose surrender. His panic mutated into pure, blind aggression. He refused to let the man he viewed as a pathetic construction worker destroy his perfect life. He reasoned that his father's counterattack relied entirely on my remaining a free and legally competent individual. If I was legally incapacitated, all of my recent corporate directives could be challenged and reversed in a court of law. David grabbed his desk phone and furiously dialed the private number of the corrupt medical officer he had bribed just weeks prior. I knew this because Hayes had already tapped his corporate lines. The doctor answered cautiously. David did not allow him to speak. He abandoned the original timeline completely. He ordered the physician to gather his sedative kit and meet him at my suburban estate in exactly 1 hour. David demanded they execute the emergency psychiatric hold today. He intended to physically drag me out of my own house by sheer force. He actually believed he could still win this war by locking his father in a padded room before the sun went down. I turned off the computer monitor in my study and stood up. I straightened my tailored suit. Let him come. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across my manicured lawn when the screech of heavy tires broke the quiet suburban silence. 3 vehicles turned violently into my long, circular driveway, braking hard against the pristine cobblestone. David's leased luxury sedan led the pack, followed closely by Cynthia's imported SUV and a nondescript white sedan. The doors flew open in unison. David marched up the slate walkway with a rigid, aggressive stride, entirely dropping the facade of the dutiful son. Heather and Cynthia flanked him closely, their faces twisted into identical expressions of arrogant triumph. They walked with the absolute certainty of conquerors arriving to claim their spoils. Trailing slightly behind them was a tall, nervous man wearing a pristine white medical coat over a cheap, wrinkled suit. He carried a heavy black leather medical bag strapped securely across his shoulder. I recognized the distinct shape of a chemical sedative kit protruding from the side pocket. They had actually brought a corrupt physician to drug me in my own home. David had abandoned all pretense of a slow legal battle and opted for a direct physical abduction. He intended to inject his own father with heavy chemical restraints, drag me out of my house in broad daylight, and lock me away in a state ward before the sun set. The sheer audacity of their intrusion solidified the ice in my veins. They had driven onto my property expecting an easy victory over a helpless target. They expected to find a terrified, confused old man cowering behind a locked door, desperately calling for a police intervention that would arrive far too late to stop a certified medical extraction. They were completely wrong. I did not cower inside the house. I sat perfectly still in the center of my wide front porch, occupying a heavy teakwood armchair. I wore the same custom-tailored navy suit I had worn to the steakhouse, sharply pressed and entirely immaculate. A thin trail of blue smoke drifted upward from the premium Cuban cigar resting between my fingers. I took a slow, deliberate draw, letting the rich tobacco burn hot before exhaling a thick cloud into the cool evening air. I projected absolute, terrifying calm. Standing silently to my right, completely immovable, was Attorney Hayes. He wore a charcoal gray suit and held a thick, reinforced leather briefcase firmly against his side. We looked less like a retired construction worker and his lawyer, and more like a highly paid corporate execution squad awaiting our targets. David stopped dead at the bottom of the porch stairs. The arrogant momentum completely vanished from his posture. He stared at my tailored suit, the burning cigar, and the stone-cold expression on Hayes's face. His brain struggled violently to process the scene unfolding in front of him. He had expected pajamas panic and a pathetic display of confusion. He found an apex predator waiting patiently in the open. Heather bumped heavily into his shoulder, her eyes darting nervously toward Hayes and the locked briefcase. Cynthia gripped the leather strap of her designer purse, her triumphant smirk dissolving into a mask of deep uncertainty. The corrupt medical officer halted several feet behind them, shifting his heavy sedative kit to his other shoulder, clearly unnerved by our total lack of reaction to their hostile invasion. I did not stand up to greet them. I simply tapped the ash from my cigar into the crystal tray beside me and waited in absolute silence. The burden of the first move belonged entirely to the intruders standing on my lawn. David desperately attempted to regain control of the narrative. He cleared his throat loudly, squaring his shoulders, and stepped onto the first wooden stair. He forced an expression of profound theatrical sorrow onto his face. He turned slightly to ensure the medical officer could hear him clearly, projecting his voice across the meticulously landscaped yard. David declared that it absolutely broke his heart to see his father in this tragic, delusional state. He falsely claimed that I had completely lost my mind, citing severe paranoid delusions and a total, unrecoverable break from physical reality. He stated with absolute conviction that I was an immediate danger to myself and required urgent institutionalization for my own safety and the safety of the public. The corrupt doctor nodded nervously, resting his sweating hand on the zipper of his medical bag, readying the heavy chemical restraints. Heather forcefully pushed past her husband, abandoning the fake sympathy entirely. She marched up the wooden stairs, pointing a sharp, manicured finger directly at my chest. She shrilly demanded that I hand over the heavy brass house keys and the main security alarm codes immediately. She shouted that I no longer had any legal right to occupy the property and explicitly threatened to have the doctor sedate me by physical force if I did not surrender within 60 seconds. She looked around the expansive porch, already mentally measuring the space for her own expensive patio furniture. Cynthia stood safely at the bottom of the steps, loudly agreeing with her aggressive daughter. She yelled that I was a stubborn old fool who needed to be locked away immediately before I destroyed the entire family legacy. They screamed their ridiculous demands entirely blind to the steel trap they had willingly walked into. I did not raise my voice in retaliation. I did not engage with Heather's hysterical screaming or Cynthia's pathetic insults. I took one final slow draw from my cigar and crushed the burning ember out in the heavy crystal ashtray. I stood up from the teakwood chair with slow, deliberate precision. The sudden, calm movement silenced them instantly. I ignored David and his aggressive wife completely. I walked directly past my son descending the wooden steps with a steady, commanding rhythm. I stopped directly in front of the corrupt medical officer. The man swallowed hard, taking a rapid half-step backward under the crushing weight of my stare. I did not threaten him with physical violence. I reached out and picked up a thick, heavy manila folder resting on the small, wrought iron patio table beside the stairs. I extended my arm and pressed the heavy envelope directly against the doctor's chest. He instinctively raised his shaking hands to take it. I instructed him to open the folder and read the very first page before he unzipped his sedative kit. The physician hesitated, glancing nervously at David for permission, but the sheer, undeniable authority in my voice compelled him to obey. He flipped open the cover of the manila envelope. His eyes scanned the top document printed on crisp white paper. I watched the biological reaction hit him with devastating, instantaneous speed. His pupils dilated in sheer terror. The flush of color vanished entirely from his cheeks, leaving his face a stark, sickly white. His hands began to shake violently. The heavy medical bag slipped off his shoulder and hit the concrete walkway with a loud, resounding thud. He realized he was not here to drug a helpless old man. He had just walked straight into a massive federal snare. The corrupt medical officer stared down at the contents of the manila folder, his breath catching in his throat with a sharp, audible gasp. Resting on top of the stack were high-resolution photographs taken by my private investigators. The images perfectly captured David, handing thick white envelopes stuffed with cash to this very doctor in the dimly lit lower level of a hospital parking garage. Beneath those damning photographs lay a fully drafted comprehensive report addressed directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The document detailed a highly organized conspiracy to commit federal medical fraud, insurance manipulation, and the attempted chemical restraint of a legally competent individual. The physician recognized immediately that his entire medical license, his freedom, and his life were evaporating before his eyes. He did not utter a single word in his defense. He did not look at David. He simply dropped the open folder onto the slate walkway, leaving the photographs scattered across the stone. He spun around on his heels and sprinted down the driveway toward his unmarked white sedan. Panic fueled his steps as he fumbled for his keys, practically throwing himself into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life with a desperate whine. He threw the car into reverse, the tires screeching loudly against the cobblestone, and sped away from my estate at a reckless speed. He abandoned his heavy medical bag, containing the chemical sedatives right where it fell. David watched his hired gun vanish down the suburban street, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. The absolute certainty that had propelled him onto my property just moments ago completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold rising tide of pure terror. He turned his head slowly, looking back at the porch, where Hayes and I remained perfectly still. David took a frantic step forward, his previous arrogance entirely replaced by a shrill, desperate panic. He demanded to know exactly what was in that folder and what I had done to scare off his doctor. He tried to project righteous anger, but his voice cracked, betraying the sheer magnitude of his fear. I did not bother to answer him. I gave a slight nod to Marcus Hayes. My attorney stepped forward with the mechanical precision of an executioner. He unlatched his heavy leather briefcase and retrieved a massive spiral-bound document. Hayes walked down the porch steps and shoved the forensic financial audit directly into David's chest, forcing my son to grab the heavy binder or let it fall. I finally spoke, my voice resonating with absolute, unforgiving authority. I told David that the charade was permanently over. I detailed the exact routing numbers, the hidden offshore accounts, and the precise increments of money he had siphoned from the secondary family trust. I spoke the exact dollar amounts aloud, letting the massive figures hang in the crisp evening air. I described how he had systematically dismantled the sacred fund I had built to honor his late mother's memory. I stripped away the pathetic facade of his corporate success piece by piece. I told him that I knew he was not a brilliant executive closing massive mergers, but merely a glorified parasite bleeding his own family dry to finance a manufactured reality. He had traded his mother's legacy for imported champagne luxury cars and the hollow admiration of a high society crowd that would forget his name the second his credit cards stopped working. David stared down at the audit in his trembling hands, the blood draining from his face as he realized the true extent of my surveillance. With David completely paralyzed by the sheer weight of his exposure, I shifted my focus directly to the two women standing frozen on my walkway. Heather and Cynthia were still struggling to process the sudden flight of the medical officer and the complete collapse of David's authority. They looked like cornered animals realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. I turned my attention to Cynthia first. She had spent the last 3 years parading around the city, boasting about her elite status and her wealthy son-in-law. I informed her with absolute clarity that the luxury downtown condominium she currently occupied was purchased entirely with stolen capital. I told her she did not own a single square foot of that property. The deed belonged entirely to the newly formed blind trust operated strictly by Apex Horizon LLC. Her illusion of high society living was a complete financial fabrication. I then turned my gaze to Heather. Her face was pale, her designer sunglasses pushed up into her hair. I systematically dismantled the lie of her prestigious vanity project. I informed her that the commercial building housing her luxury designer boutique was not a fortunate lease negotiated by her husband. It was a property owned outright by my corporate conglomerate. I told her that her business was a complete financial black hole, generating absolutely zero profit and operating entirely in the red. The only reason her doors remained open was because David had been illegally pumping stolen trust funds into her failing accounts just to keep up appearances. I stripped away their entire manufactured reality, leaving them with nothing but the cold, undeniable truth of their own profound inadequacy. They were living in castles made of stolen sand, and I had just summoned the tide. The brutal reality of their situation hung heavily over the driveway, but I was not finished. A verbal reprimand was entirely insufficient for the level of betrayal they had orchestrated. I needed them to feel the immediate physical consequences of their greed. Hayes stepped forward again, bypassing David entirely. He walked directly up to Cynthia, his expression maintaining the cold detachment of a seasoned corporate lawyer. He produced a crisp, certified legal document bearing the heavy embossed seal of Apex Horizon LLC. He handed it directly to her. Cynthia took the paper with trembling, manicured hands. Her eyes darted rapidly across the bold, black print at the top of the page, It was a formal, non-negotiable 30-day eviction notice. The document explicitly stated that her authorization to reside in the corporate-owned condominium was permanently revoked due to fraudulent acquisition. Cynthia realized in a fraction of a second that her lavish lifestyle was completely annihilated. She was suddenly an unauthorized tenant about to be rendered entirely homeless by the end of the month. The shock paralyzing her features instantly warped into a violent, uncontrolled rage. However, she did not direct her fury toward me or my attorney. She turned violently toward David. She crumpled the eviction notice in her fist and screamed at her son-in-law, her voice echoing shrilly across the manicured lawn. She demanded to know how he could be so incredibly stupid to let this happen. She shrieked that he had promised her security and luxury, demanding that he fix the situation immediately or face absolute ruin. The unholy alliance they had formed to destroy me fractured instantly under the pressure of actual consequence. The predators had completely turned on each other. Cynthia's shrill accusations against David echoed across the manicured lawn, but Heather refused to accept the collapse of her fabricated reality. She stepped sharply in front of her husband, physically inserting herself between David and my attorney. Her face was flushed with a volatile mixture of panic and deep-seated arrogance. She pointed her finger at me, her manicured nail trembling with unbridled rage. Heather believed she possessed the ultimate trump card in our family dynamic, the one emotional weapon that could force a wealthy patriarch into total submission. She loudly threatened to cut off all future contact, declaring that if I did not immediately instruct Hayes to restore her access to the commercial property and reinstate David's corporate banking privileges, I would never be permitted to see my future grandchildren. She painted a vivid, cruel picture of my absolute isolation, promising that I would die an incredibly lonely old man in an empty house while my lineage flourished entirely without me. She attempted to use the unborn heirs of my late wife's legacy as simple bargaining chips to maintain her supply of imported shoes and luxury vehicles. Heather stood tall, crossing her arms over her chest, fully expecting the threat of an empty bloodline to shatter my resolve. She waited for the hesitation, anticipating the moment my rigid posture would crumble under the devastating prospect of eternal family estrangement. She fundamentally misunderstood the man standing in front of her. I did not view her threat as a tragic emotional loss. I viewed it as the final absolute confirmation of their shared moral bankruptcy. I looked at Heather standing defiantly on the cobblestone, and I let out a dry, harsh laugh. The sound contained absolutely zero humor. It was a cold, abrasive noise that instantly wiped the triumphant sneer off her face. I stepped down onto the final stair, closing the physical distance between us. I informed her that she was attempting to negotiate with casino chips she did not even possess. I spoke with absolute terrifying clarity, detailing the exact events that had occurred while she was busy filming social media videos at a luxury car dealership. I told Heather that at exactly 4 o'clock this morning, a team of private corporate security contractors had arrived at her prestigious boutique. They had drilled out the deadbolts, installed heavy commercial padlocks, and completely secured the perimeter before the sun even rose. Her business no longer existed in any operational capacity. Heather's mouth opened in sheer shock, but I did not give her a single second to formulate a response. I explained that an elite squad of corporate liquidators was currently inside the building, systematically boxing up every single designer dress, every imported handbag, and every piece of overpriced jewelry she had curated over the years. The entire inventory was being legally seized, itemized, and scheduled for immediate public auction to aggressively recoup the $400,000 her husband had actively embezzled from my family trust. I watched the blood drain entirely from her face as the mathematical reality crushed her delusions of grandeur. She was not a successful entrepreneur facing a temporary cash flow issue. She was an unemployed, legally barred trespasser whose entire professional identity had just been dismantled and packed into cardboard boxes. The luxury sports car she had flaunted online would be repossessed by the dealership before the weekend arrived. I told her that she had no business, no assets, and absolutely no leverage left to offer. I turned my gaze away from Heather's devastated expression and locked eyes directly with my son. David was trembling, his expensive designer suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big for his shrinking frame. I did not shout. I delivered a slow, devastating verbal autopsy of his entire existence. I reminded David of the brutal, unforgiving world I had navigated in the early 1970s. I spoke of the racial and economic hell I fought through, facing relentless prejudice, corrupt zoning boards, and arrogant bankers who laughed at my loan applications simply because of where I came from. I detailed the decades of calloused hands, shattered sleep, and absolute physical exhaustion I endured to pull our family out of the dirt. I sacrificed the best years of my youth working entirely in the shadows specifically, so David would never have to know the sharp gnawing ache of real hunger. I built a multi-million-dollar fortress to shield him from the cruelty of the world. I gave him the finest private education, unencumbered opportunity, and a guaranteed seat at a corporate table he did not have to bleed to build. I expected him to honor that profound sacrifice with basic decency, hard work, and responsible stewardship. Instead, David rewarded my lifetime of brutal labor by transforming into an entitled, spineless parasite. I told him he had adopted the absolute worst traits of the wealthy elite, while possessing absolutely none of the grit required to maintain that wealth. He was a hollow imitation of a man attempting to steal an empire he could not even begin to understand, relying on forged signatures and cowardly deceptions. The crushing silence descended upon the driveway, heavy and suffocating. The absolute reality of the situation finally settled into the minds of the 3 intruders. They were standing on the manicured lawn of an estate they would never inherit, holding premium credit cards that no longer functioned, fighting for a lifestyle that had been legally vaporized in a single morning. They possessed no money, no property, and absolutely zero legal standing to challenge the impenetrable fortress I had secured around my assets. David looked at Hayes, searching the attorney's stoic face for any glimmer of a procedural loophole or a chance at mediation, but found only the cold certainty of a flawless legal execution. Slowly, David turned his head to look at the 2 women standing beside him. The dynamic had shifted with terrifying speed. Cynthia was clutching her formal eviction notice, her face twisted into a mask of pure vicious self-preservation. Heather was staring at the ground, processing the total destruction of her boutique, her social standing, and her stolen sports car. Neither woman was looking at me with hatred anymore. Their eyes were locked entirely on David. The man who had promised them an endless fountain of stolen wealth was now the sole reason for their complete financial annihilation. David saw the sheer predatory fury building in his wife's eyes. He saw his mother-in-law calculating exactly how quickly she could distance herself from a federal embezzlement investigation. The unholy alliance forged in greed was fracturing into a million jagged pieces right in front of him. David realized with absolute agonizing clarity that they were about to turn on him completely. He was entirely isolated, stripped of his stolen armor, and thrown to the wolves he had invited into his own house. Cynthia's shriek hung in the cool evening air, a sharp, ugly sound that finally shattered the paralyzed silence of the driveway. David did not cower under her verbal assault. The raw, suffocating panic of his impending federal indictment ignited a vicious, cornered fury deep within him. He rounded on his mother-in-law, his face flushed dark red with unbridled rage. He shouted that he had risked 20 years in a federal penitentiary, specifically to keep a luxury roof over her ungrateful head. He then turned his venom entirely toward his wife, his voice cracking violently under the immense strain. David screamed that Heather's insatiable pathological need for elite status had driven him to dismantle the family trust in the first place. He pointed at the empty street where the corrupt doctor had fled, yelling that he had orchestrated a medical kidnapping solely to float her failing vanity project and pay for a sports car she had absolutely no right to drive. Heather recoiled, her perfectly manicured exterior cracking into an ugly defensive snarl. She refused to accept even a fraction of the blame. She violently shifted the target, turning her fury directly back onto her own mother. Heather shrieked that Cynthia was nothing but a pathetic leech who had spent the last 3 years bleeding their marriage dry. She accused her mother of manipulating David's deep-seated insecurities to secure a free luxury condominium, contributing absolutely nothing, while demanding premium imported champagne and endless shopping sprees. The pristine driveway transformed into a vicious arena of character assassination. The polished high society facade they had worn to intimidate me burned away entirely, leaving behind 3 desperate, terrified accomplices clawing at each other's throats to escape a sinking ship. They hurled hidden secrets and bitter resentments into the open air, each desperately trying to construct a narrative where they were the sole victim of the other's overwhelming greed. I did not raise my voice to interrupt their mutual destruction. I took a slow step backward and leaned comfortably against the heavy wooden railing of the front porch. I crossed my arms over my chest and watched the total collapse of an alliance built entirely on the fragile foundation of stolen money. Attorney Hayes remained perfectly still beside me, his reinforced leather briefcase resting against his leg, observing the spectacle with the detached clinical interest of a pathologist. There was absolutely no need for me to utter another word. They were executing my retribution with far more cruelty than I could ever manufacture. I listened as they weaponized years of hidden resentments, tearing each other apart with the precise, intimate knowledge only family members possess. I thought about the brutal winters I had survived out during the early days of my construction firm. I remembered the long, freezing nights when my late wife and I shared a single bowl of cheap soup wrapped in heavy blankets because we could not afford to turn on the radiator. We had absolutely nothing in those days except a fiercely guarded loyalty to one another. Poverty is the absolute uncompromising crucible of human character. It burns away pretense and exposes the raw, undeniable truth of who a person really is. Sarah and I had passed that test by clinging to each other in the dark. David, Heather, and Cynthia were failing it spectacularly before the financial freeze had even lasted a full 24 hours. They had only loved the comfort my money provided. The moment that unearned luxury was permanently vaporized, their manufactured affection for one another evaporated into thin air. They were strangers bound together by a criminal conspiracy, and now that the vault was locked, there was no reason to maintain the charade. I watched my son scream at the woman he had married, his face contorted in selfish terror, and I felt the last agonizing thread of my paternal attachment sever completely. Cynthia was the first to recognize the absolute futility of the argument. She realized that screaming at a ruined man would not reverse her certified eviction notice or secure her next hot meal. She stopped yelling abruptly, her chest heaving with heavy exertion. She shot David a look of profound, undiluted disgust, treating him exactly like the pathetic, discarded asset he had officially become. Without offering a single word of farewell to her daughter, Cynthia spun on her expensive heels and marched down the long driveway toward the main suburban road. She pulled her cellular phone from her designer purse, her fingers jabbing the screen to summon a ride service, desperately fleeing the blast radius of David's impending federal arrest. Heather watched her mother abandon her, the reality of her total isolation finally registering in her wide, panicked eyes. She turned back to look at the man she had married. She did not see a powerful corporate executive or a wealthy provider. She saw a terrified criminal staring down a lengthy prison sentence and total bankruptcy. Heather adjusted the strap of her purse, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, self-serving survival. She turned her back on her husband and walked quickly down the cobblestone path following her mother's exact escape route. She did not glance over her shoulder. She did not offer a single word of comfort or solidarity. She simply walked away from the wreckage, leaving David standing entirely alone in the center of the driveway. The aggressive, entitled posture that had defined his arrival was completely extinguished. His shoulders slumped forward, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides. The imported luxury vehicles parked behind him no longer represented wealth, They were merely heavy steel anchors tying him to a massive financial fraud. The heavy silence of the estate returned, broken only by the distant fading sound of Cynthia and Heather's footsteps on the asphalt. David stood frozen in the center of the driveway, staring blankly at the empty space where his accomplices had just abandoned him. The sheer gravity of his absolute ruin finally crushed the last remaining pillars of his ego. His knees gave out. He collapsed directly onto the hard cobblestone, the sharp impact tearing the fabric of his expensive designer trousers. He did not attempt to stand back up. He dropped his hands to the pavement and began to crawl forward, dragging his body toward the base of the wooden porch steps. The transformation was pathetic and total. The arrogant predator who had arrived to forcefully drug and imprison his father had been reduced to a weeping, broken shell. He looked up at me, his face streaked with tears, and his breath hitching in ragged, uncontrolled gasps. He begged for a second chance, his voice cracking as he pleaded for an ounce of mercy. He promised to sign any confession, to work the lowest labor position in the company, to do absolutely anything to avoid a federal indictment. When my expression did not soften, David resorted to the ultimate, unforgivable manipulation. He invoked the sacred memory of my late wife. He cried out that his mother would never want to see her only child locked inside a federal penitentiary. He weaponized Sarah's boundless grace, desperately trying to use the ghost of the woman he had robbed to shield himself from the brutal consequences of his actions. I stared down at my son, kneeling in the dirt, the mention of my wife's name hanging like poison in the crisp evening air. I stared down at the man kneeling on the hard cobblestone. He was weeping loudly, his expensive suit stained with dirt, and the overwhelming reality of his defeat. A profound, heavy sadness settled deep in my chest. It was the grief of finally accepting that the boy I had raised was entirely gone, replaced by this hollow, cowardly stranger begging in my driveway. But alongside that sadness, there was absolutely zero weakness. I did not reach down to comfort him. I did not offer a hand to help him stand. I kept my posture rigid and my voice dangerously quiet. I told David that invoking his mother's name at this exact moment was the absolute pinnacle of cowardice. I reminded him that Sarah had worked her fingers to the bone living on cheap soup and wearing threadbare coats during our early years specifically so he could have a secure future. I stated clearly that he had taken the sacred trust fund built specifically to honor her brutal sacrifice and drained it to buy luxury cars and fund empty, arrogant lifestyles. He had spat on her memory with every fraudulent wire transfer he authorized. To beg for mercy in her name after systematically violating her legacy was an insult I would not tolerate. I ordered him to stop crying. I demanded that he stand up and face the consequences of his actions like the man he pretended to be in his corporate office. David choked on his tears, his hands gripping the edge of my tailored trousers. I stepped back, forcing his hands to fall onto the empty pavement. I looked at Hayes, signaling that the time for emotional appeals was officially over. We were moving to the final transaction. I turned my attention back to David, who was slowly pulling himself up from the driveway. He stood unsteadily, his head bowed, unable to meet my gaze. I laid out the absolute, non-negotiable reality of his situation. I informed him that the private investigator's high-resolution photographs, the forensic audit of the Memorial Trust, and the sworn confession of his corrupt medical officer were currently resting in a sealed envelope in Marcus Hayes's office. I explained that a courier was standing by, ready to deliver that exact package directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Federal embezzlement, wire fraud, and the attempted chemical restraint of a legally competent individual carried a mandatory minimum sentence that would ensure David spent the next 2 decades in a concrete cell. I let that terrifying reality sink into his mind. Then I offered him a single exceedingly narrow exit. I stated that I would permanently withhold the criminal files from the federal authorities on one absolute condition. Hayes opened his reinforced leather briefcase and retrieved a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents. I told David that Heather and Cynthia were going to sign a comprehensive, irrevocable legal waiver. This document explicitly surrendered any and all future claims to my estate, my corporate holdings, my private properties, and my liquid assets. They were legally acknowledging their financial crimes and permanently disenfranchising themselves from the apex horizon fortune. I made it entirely clear that if he refused to sign, or if he attempted to negotiate a single clause, Hayes would make the phone call to the federal prosecutor right now on this very driveway. David stared at the documents in Hayes's hands. He looked down the street where his wife and mother-in-law had abandoned him. He was completely trapped. He had no legal representation, no leverage, and absolutely no time to formulate a counter-strategy. He was staring at the physical manifestation of his total defeat. Hayes did not invite David inside the house to review the paperwork. He walked over to my heavy steel utility truck, parked near the garage, and slapped the thick stack of legal waivers directly onto the cold metal hood. He pulled a silver pen from his breast pocket and set it down beside the documents. He pointed to the highlighted signature lines, his face completely devoid of empathy. David stumbled toward the truck. His breathing was shallow and ragged. He picked up the pen, his hand shaking so violently he could barely secure a grip on the silver barrel. He stared at the printed text, realizing the absolute finality of what he was about to do. By pressing that pen to paper, he was officially signing away his entire safety net. He was permanently severing his access to the multi-million-dollar empire he had assumed would automatically become his. He was trading his entire future for the simple privilege of avoiding a federal prison uniform. David looked at me one last time, offering a desperate, silent plea for a reprieve. I maintained eye contact completely unblinking, offering him absolutely nothing. He lowered his head, pressed the pen to the heavy paper, and signed his name. He flipped to the next page and signed again. He initialed every clause acknowledging his theft, verifying his complete disinheritance, and accepting his immediate removal from the corporate structure. He signed away the mansions, the luxury vehicles, the elite status, and the generational wealth. The sharp scratch of the pen against the paper was the only sound in the quiet suburban evening. When he reached the final page, the pen slipped from his fingers and clattered loudly onto the concrete. Hayes immediately stepped forward, collected the signed documents, and secured them safely inside his briefcase. The transaction was legally binding and entirely complete. I looked at the ruined man standing beside my truck. I did not offer any parting words of wisdom or hollow fatherly advice. I simply pointed toward the end of my long driveway and ordered him to get off my property. David flinched as if he had been physically struck. He turned slowly and began to walk away. He did not have the keys to the luxury sedan still parked on the cobblestone, as that vehicle was now legally seized under the corporate freeze. He walked down the center of the street on foot, completely stripped of his car, his stolen cash, and his arrogance. I watched his silhouette grow smaller in the fading twilight, until he disappeared entirely beyond the heavy iron gates of my estate. The silence of the neighborhood rushed back in deep and absolute. I turned to Hayes. The corporate attorney gave a single, firm nod. We walked up the wooden stairs and stepped back inside my house, locking the heavy oak door behind us. The immediate threat had been neutralized. The ambush had been dismantled, and the parasites had been surgically removed from the host. But the war was not entirely over. The initial battle was won, but leaving a massive financial vacuum in an empire only invites new predators. I walked into my private study and looked at the massive architectural blueprints spread across my desk. I had successfully severed the infected branches of my family tree, but now I had to permanently secure the future of the roots. 2 months passed with the heavy, unrelenting momentum of a freight train. The blistering heat of late summer surrendered to the biting chill of autumn, and with that change in season came the absolute enforcement of my iron boundary. I completely severed my physical and digital presence from their lives, leaving them to navigate the brutal reality of the financial vacuum they had created. The luxurious fantasy world they had inhabited evaporated, replaced instantly by the grinding, unforgiving machinery of the working class. David did not secure a high-level executive position at a rival firm. His reputation, quietly but thoroughly dismantled within my corporate sphere, preceded him. He was forced to accept a position as a junior data entry clerk for a mid-sized logistics company on the industrial outskirts of the city. He spent 10 hours a day trapped inside a cramped, windowless cubicle illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. The man who had previously occupied corner offices and ordered expensive catered lunches now stared blankly at endless spreadsheets inputting shipping manifests until his eyes burned. He wore cheap off-the-rack slacks that chafed his skin, a stark departure from the custom-tailored Italian wool he had purchased with his mother's stolen memorial funds. His daily commute involved 2 crowded city buses standing shoulder to shoulder with the exact demographic of laborers he had spent his entire adult life mocking. He returned to a decaying, overpriced rental apartment every evening with aching feet and a bruised spine, deeply dreading the moment he had to turn his key in the lock. The arrogance that had fueled his attempt to drug and imprison me was systematically crushed out of him by the relentless, soul-destroying monotony of menial labor. He was finally experiencing the exact life of quiet desperation I had sacrificed my own youth to spare him from, forced to survive solely on the meager wages his actual skills commanded. The devastating plunge into the working class hit Heather with even greater ferocity. Stripped of her fraudulent boutique and her stolen sports car, she was thrust into the very retail environment she had spent years aggressively looking down upon. Without a genuine resume or any marketable skills, she was forced to accept a minimum wage position at a heavily discounted clothing outlet in a dying suburban mall. Her days were spent folding cheap polyester garments, standing on hard concrete floors for 8 uninterrupted hours, and enduring the harsh reprimands of a retail store manager half her age. The absolute pinnacle of her daily humiliation occurred when former acquaintances from her manufactured high society life wandered into the outlet looking for bargain deals. She was forced to plaster on a mandated corporate smile and ring up the purchases of the exact socialites she had previously mocked over imported champagne at elite charity galas. They looked right through her, treating her with the same dismissive contempt she had once directed at my own domestic staff. She was learning the true excruciating cost of a single dollar the hard way, forced to calculate exactly how many hours of physical pain were required to afford basic groceries and transportation. Cynthia's reality was equally grim and unforgiving. Evicted from the luxury condominium my company owned, she found herself entirely devoid of assets, savings, or sympathetic friends. She had alienated everyone in her ruthless pursuit of elite status, leaving her completely isolated when the financial floor collapsed beneath her feet. She was currently residing in a cramped, unheated studio apartment on the absolute edge of the city limits. The walls were paper-thin, and the antique radiator clicked loudly without producing any actual heat to combat the falling temperatures. She spent her days wrapped in a heavy moth-eaten sweater, staring at the peeling paint on the ceiling, violently regretting the day she had convinced her daughter to manipulate a wealthy widower. The 3 of them had built their entire identities around the illusion of endless wealth, and the sudden violent removal of that wealth exposed them to the freezing, uncompromising elements of the real world. Without the thick, insulating buffer of my money to artificially sustain their relationship, David and Heather's marriage rapidly disintegrated into a toxic battleground. They had never actually loved each other in any meaningful capacity. Their union was a financial transaction, a partnership of convenience built entirely on mutual greed and a shared desire for unearned status. Trapped together inside a tiny, drafty apartment, they turned their misery entirely upon each other. The evenings were consumed by vicious, screaming arguments that echoed through the thin drywall of their living room. Heather constantly blamed David for his incompetence, shrieking that his sheer stupidity had cost them a multi-million-dollar empire and forced her into a life of retail servitude. She mocked his menial data entry job and openly despised his inability to provide the luxury she felt she intrinsically deserved. David retaliated with equal venom. He aggressively reminded her that it was her insatiable parasitic demands that drove him to embezzle from his own mother's trust fund in the first place. He screamed that her vanity boutique and her endless shopping sprees were the exact reasons he was currently dodging federal prison. They weaponized their shared failures, tearing at each other's insecurities with brutal precision. The lavish vacations and expensive dinners that had previously masked their complete lack of compatibility were gone, leaving them with nothing but raw, unfiltered resentment. They slept on opposite sides of a cheap, sagging mattress, united only by their mutual hatred and the crushing weight of their shared poverty. The quiet mornings were just as volatile as the nights filled with slammed doors and hostile silence. David realized that he was chained to a woman who only valued him for his proximity to my checking account, while Heather understood that she was legally tethered to a man devoid of genuine ambition or capability. They had gambled their entire existence on a highly illegal scheme to declare me mentally incompetent, and losing that gamble had condemned them to a prison of their own making. The brutal reality of their situation escalated as the harsh winter winds began to sweep through the city. The temperature plummeted, turning their poorly insulated apartment into a freezing, miserable enclosure. David returned from another soul-crushing shift at the logistics company to find a thick envelope resting in their dented metal mailbox. He tore it open with freezing fingers, his breath pluming in the frigid air. It was a final notice from the municipal utility company detailing a massive overdue heating bill that he possessed absolutely no means to pay. The document clearly stated that all services would be permanently disconnected within 48 hours if the balance was not settled in full. David stared at the bold red print, a cold panic seizing his chest. He looked at his bank account balance on his cracked cellular phone, seeing only double digits. He had no credit cards, no assets to liquidate, and no friends willing to loan him a single cent. He stood in the freezing hallway, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Desperation completely overrode his lingering shame. He convinced himself that 2 months of grueling punishment must have been enough to satisfy my need for retribution. He desperately wanted to believe that the passage of time had softened my heart, that the biological tie between a father and a son would eventually override the memory of a profound betrayal. Shivering violently in the dim light of the corridor, David pulled up my personal contact number on his screen. He pressed the call button, raising the phone to his ear and listening to the electronic ringing, praying for a rescue he absolutely did not deserve. The dial tone echoed in the silent, freezing apartment stairwell. He closed his eyes, practicing a pathetic, tearful apology in his mind, desperately preparing to offer whatever hollow promises were required to get the heating grid turned back on before the winter storm hit. He completely ignored the reality that I had spent the last 2 months fortifying my emotional boundaries against this exact scenario. He believed his suffering was the ultimate tragedy, entirely blind to the fact that his current freezing reality was merely the natural consequence of trying to steal an empire. I sat in the heavy leather chair behind my mahogany desk, the expansive blueprints still unrolled beneath my hands. The quiet of the estate was profound, insulating me from the biting winter wind howling against the reinforced window panes. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sharp, persistent vibration of my cellular phone resting on the polished wood. The screen illuminated the darkened study, casting a harsh white glare across the architectural plans. I looked down and saw David's name flashing across the digital display. My heart seized with a sudden, violent jolt. A powerful, deeply ingrained biological instinct flared instantly in my chest, screaming at me to answer the call. This was my son. This was the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle, the child I had carried on my shoulders when he was too tired to walk. Decades of paternal conditioning flooded my mind, urging me to pick up the receiver, to listen to his desperate pleas, and to deploy my vast resources to save him from whatever disaster he had inevitably created. The paternal urge to protect, to shield my offspring from the cold and the pain, was an almost physical ache. I knew exactly where he was calling from. My security contractors had meticulously monitored his employment and his residential status. I knew he was trapped in a freezing, dilapidated apartment, facing utility disconnection and absolute ruin. My thumb hovered inches above the glowing green icon. A single press would reconnect the severed bond. A single word could authorize a financial transfer that would instantly restore his heat, fill his refrigerator, and end his immediate suffering. The temptation to revert to my role as his ultimate savior was agonizingly strong. My thumb lingered over the screen as the phone continued to vibrate, but the paralyzing wave of paternal instinct slowly began to recede, replaced by a crystalline, uncompromising clarity. I forced myself to look past the biological illusion of the vulnerable child and remember the terrifying reality of the grown man. I vividly recalled the crisp manila folder resting on my patio table containing the forged psychiatric evaluation he had purchased with stolen cash. I remembered the sheer calculated cruelty of his plan to inject me with chemical sedatives, drag me from my own property, and lock me inside a state ward for the rest of my natural life. I heard the echo of his arrogant, mocking laughter, bouncing off the mahogany walls of the upscale steakhouse, entirely dismissing the lifetime of brutal labor I had endured to give him the world. He had not viewed me as a father. He had viewed me as a disposable asset, a hurdle to be chemically eliminated to expedite his inheritance. Answering the phone now would not be an act of love or salvation. It would be an act of supreme weakness. Rescuing David from the freezing consequences of his own monumental greed would merely reset the toxic cycle of abuse. It would teach him that his actions carried no permanent weight, that he could orchestrate the destruction of his family and simply apologize his way back into the vault. I realized that true paternal strength sometimes requires inflicting absolute, unyielding discipline. The greatest lesson I could ever teach him was the unalterable reality of severe consequences. My jaw tightened into a rigid line. I pulled my hand away from the glowing green icon and pressed my finger down firmly on the red decline button. The ringing abruptly stopped, plunging the study back into total silence. I did not stop there. I navigated through the digital menu with deliberate precision and permanently blocked his number. I severed the final digital thread connecting us, plunging David into the absolute darkness he had built for himself. The screen of the phone went black, mirroring the absolute finality of my decision. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and walked slowly through the massive corridors of my suburban estate. My footsteps echoed hollowly against the imported marble floors and the soaring vaulted ceilings. I walked through the grand dining room, where we had hosted countless family dinners, through the expansive living room, where David had eagerly opened his childhood gifts, and past the sweeping staircase where my late wife used to wait for me to return from the construction sites. I looked at the pristine, manicured luxury that surrounded me, and I felt absolutely nothing but a crushing sense of emptiness. The mansion no longer represented the hard-won victory of a successful patriarch. It had transformed into a towering monument to a fractured past. The walls were irreparably tainted with the memory of David's betrayal, Heather's screaming entitlement, and Cynthia's pathetic arrogance. Every custom fixture and expensive piece of artwork served as a bitter daily reminder of the greed that had poisoned my bloodline. The sheer size of the property, once a source of immense pride and comfort, now felt incredibly suffocating. I realized with absolute certainty that I no longer needed this grand fortress to validate my existence or my achievements. I did not need to maintain a sprawling, empty castle simply to prove I had conquered the poverty of my youth. I needed to cleanse the slate entirely. I returned to my study, picked up the secure landline, and immediately contacted my premier real estate broker. I instructed him to list the entire estate immediately fully furnished, requiring a rapid, seamless, and entirely confidential transaction. The real estate transaction moved with the aggressive, unstoppable momentum of a corporate acquisition. Within 14 days, a wealthy international investor purchased the entire suburban estate for a massive all-cash sum. I packed only my tailored clothing, my essential financial documents, and the framed photographs of my late wife. I left everything else behind, abandoning the imported furniture, the grand piano, and the crystal chandeliers to the new owner without a second thought. I directed my corporate attorney, Marcus Hayes, to funnel a substantial portion of the liquid capital directly into a new, highly isolated acquisition. I purchased a custom-built, heavily fortified timber cabin situated on the rugged edge of a massive, pristine lake located 300 miles north of the city. The property was completely surrounded by thousands of acres of dense, untouched pine forest, accessible only by a single winding dirt road. It was an absolute rejection of the chaotic, manufactured high society world that had infected my family. I moved my life entirely away from the noise, the traffic, and the toxic whispers of the corporate elite. I sought the profound, absolute peace that only deep nature could provide. I spent my days chopping firewood, walking along the freezing shoreline, and managing my corporate empire remotely through highly encrypted satellite connections. The initial battle for my freedom had been decisively won, and the parasites had been permanently starved out. However, as the deep winter snow began to bury the access roads to my secluded cabin, cutting me off entirely from civilization, a new urgent alert flashed across my secure terminal. The past I was about to discover refused to stay buried under the ice. The deep winter frost had finally thawed into a crisp, vibrant spring by the time Marcus Hayes navigated the winding dirt road to my lakeside cabin. We sat together on the heavy timber porch, looking out over the massive expanse of crystal blue water. Hayes opened his reinforced leather briefcase not to deliver an eviction notice or a forensic audit this time, but to present the quarterly financial reports. Apex Horizon LLC was performing with ruthless efficiency. The corporate holding company continued to generate millions of dollars in liquid profit every single month. The sheer volume of wealth accumulating in my offshore accounts was staggering, especially stripped of the massive, unceasing financial drain that David, Heather, and Cynthia had represented. The parasite had been surgically removed, and the host was thriving beyond all previous projections. However, the rapidly expanding fortune presented a new, profound question of legacy. I sat back in my wooden chair, staring at the endless rows of zeros printed on the crisp white paper. I had spent 40 grueling years building a financial fortress, specifically to secure my family bloodline. I had endured the racial prejudice and economic hell of the 1970s to ensure my son would never face the same brutal struggles. Now that bloodline was permanently severed by my own hand. The vast empire I had forged in the dirt and concrete had no designated heir. Hayes took a sip of his black coffee, waiting in absolute silence for my directive. He knew better than to offer unsolicited suggestions regarding my wealth. The decision rested entirely on my shoulders. I realized I could not simply let the fortune sit stagnant in a vault. I needed to fundamentally redefine the purpose of my life's work. I instructed Hayes to draft the foundational documents for a massive philanthropic pivot. We were going to liquidate a significant portion of the corporate profits and establish the Horizon Trade Scholarship. This would not be a hollow vanity charity designed to host elite galas or generate positive public relations. It was a highly targeted, aggressively funded initiative directed entirely toward underprivileged African American youth residing in the exact impoverished neighborhoods where I had started my own journey. I remembered the sheer desperation of being a young, driven black man in the 70s, possessing limitless ambition, but absolutely zero capital or access to institutional power. I remembered the closed doors, the dismissive bank managers, and the crushing weight of systemic poverty. I was going to systematically dismantle those barriers for the next generation. The scholarship was designed to completely cover full tuitions for elite vocational trade schools, advanced civil engineering programs, and heavy machinery operations certifications. It provided comprehensive financial stipends for living expenses, ensuring these young men and women would never have to choose between eating a meal and buying essential textbooks. I was not handing out unearned luxury. I was handing out Hammer's blueprints and the unyielding financial backing required to build a legitimate, indestructible career from the ground up. I wanted to forge a new army of architects, master carpenters, and site managers who knew the actual value of a hard-earned dollar. Instead of throwing my wealth into the black hole of David's endless entitlement, I was directly investing in calloused hands and hungry minds. I was constructing the exact economic ladder that I had desperately needed but never had. Hayes noted every directive with meticulous precision, immediately recognizing the profound shift in my operational strategy. The wealth that had nearly destroyed my family was about to fundamentally alter the trajectory of thousands of lives. I refused to manage this new enterprise from the isolated comfort of my lakeside cabin. Writing massive checks from a safe distance was exactly how I had failed to raise my own son properly. I demanded active boots-on-the-ground involvement. Several days a week, I left the quiet pine forest and drove my heavy steel utility truck directly into the heart of the city to visit the vocational training centers and engineering academies funded by my scholarship. I walked onto the active construction sites and into the dusty workshops wearing my old steel-toed boots and a faded canvas jacket. I stood shoulder to shoulder with the young men and women in the program. I did not deliver hollow motivational speeches. I shared the gritty, unvarnished reality of my 40 years in the commercial construction industry. I taught them how to read complex structural blueprints, how to negotiate brutally with corrupt suppliers, and how to command absolute respect on a chaotic job site. I showed them how to mix mortar correctly and how to spot a structural weakness before it caused a fatal collapse. I poured every ounce of my accumulated wisdom into their hungry, attentive minds. They listened to me with profound reverence hanging on my every word. They did not see me as a walking bank account to be manipulated. They saw me as a seasoned veteran, a mentor and a guide who genuinely cared about their survival and success. Through these dusty workshops and loud machinery yards, I discovered a profound, entirely unexpected joy. I was finally experiencing the pure, uncorrupted essence of genuine fatherhood. I was guiding a generation that actually appreciated the discipline, the sweat, and the sacrifice required to build a meaningful life. 2 years after severing ties with my biological son, I sat alone on the timber porch of my cabin watching the morning mist roll slowly across the surface of the massive lake. The postal courier had navigated the dirt road an hour earlier, leaving a thick stack of mail on my wooden table. Resting at the very top of the pile was a thick, heavy envelope bearing the official seal of the Horizon Trade Scholarship Program. I opened it carefully, sliding out a collection of heavy parchment pages. It was a deeply personal, handwritten letter of profound gratitude signed by the entire first graduating class of my initiative. The pages were filled with stories of young lives completely transformed. A young man detailed how he was now managing his own commercial plumbing crew instead of navigating the criminal justice system. A young woman expressed her pride in becoming a certified heavy crane operator, securing a stable future for her own children. They addressed me not just as a benefactor, but as a foundational pillar in their lives. They thanked me for demanding excellence and refusing to accept excuses. I held the heavy parchment in my hands, feeling the textured ink under my fingertips. The cold, lingering grief regarding David finally dissolved entirely, carried away by the morning breeze. I looked out at the water achieving absolute unbreakable clarity. I realized that a biological bloodline does not guarantee a legacy. Genetics only provide a starting point, completely incapable of transferring character, grit, or honor. A true legacy is not inherited through a shared last name or a trust fund. A true legacy is actively forged through shared struggles, hard-earned wisdom, and mutual respect. I had lost a son to the poison of unearned wealth, but I had gained an entire generation of builders. I sat quietly as the morning light began to filter through the dense canopy of the pine forest, tracing long, sharp shadows across my wooden porch. The heavy parchment letter from the scholarship graduates rested safely inside my desk, a profound testament to the new trajectory of my life. My mind wandered back over the chaotic, violent months that had led me to this absolute solitude. I thought about the terrifying afternoon I sat on my suburban porch, waiting for a corrupt medical officer to inject me with chemical restraints. My own flesh and blood had reduced me to a disposable obstacle, a tired old man who had supposedly outlived his financial usefulness. They had entirely underestimated the hardened architect hiding beneath the tailored suit. The journey from a discarded patriarch to a liberated corporate magnate had demanded a brutal, uncompromising toll. The pain of permanently severing ties with my only son was a deep, resonating ache that would likely never fully heal. I had mourned the boy I raised, grieving the innocent child who had slowly warped into a ruthless parasite under the corrupting influence of unearned luxury. It was a staggering emotional loss. Yet as I breathed in the crisp, frigid air of the lake, I recognized a profound truth. The grief of losing David was infinitely lighter than the suffocating agony of enduring his ongoing betrayal. I had paid an astronomical emotional price, but the transaction had purchased the ultimate prize. I had successfully preserved my own soul. I had refused to surrender my dignity to appease their insatiable greed. The quiet isolation of my cabin was not a prison. It was a fortress of absolute peace built on the uncompromising foundation of self-respect. The physical transformation I experienced following the complete removal of that toxic stress was nothing short of miraculous. For the last 3 years of my life in the city, I had operated in a state of constant, low-level physical panic. I had suffered from chronic tension headaches, a rigid jaw, and a crushing weight in my chest every time my phone illuminated with a text message from David or Heather. My body had been desperately trying to warn me of the predators lurking in my own living room. Now isolated in the deep timber of the north, those physical ailments had entirely vanished. My blood pressure had stabilized to levels I had not seen since my 40s. I breathed easier, drawing deep restorative breaths of clean forest air instead of the stagnant, anxiety-filled atmosphere of my former estate. I slept soundly through the night, no longer jolted awake by the subconscious dread of impending financial ambushes or fabricated emergencies. The sheer biological relief of establishing ironclad boundaries was staggering. I realized that my wealth had not protected my health. My unyielding enforcement of consequences had protected my health. My fortune had initially attracted the vultures, but my refusal to be consumed by them had ultimately secured my physical survival. I understood with absolute clarity that dignity is not a commodity you can purchase regardless of how many millions sit in your offshore accounts. Dignity is an inherent territory that must be fiercely, aggressively protected against any invader, even if that invader shares your own last name. I had drawn a massive, impenetrable line in the dirt, and I had defended it with everything I possessed. By refusing to compromise my integrity to save my son from his own ruin, I had effectively saved my own life. The relentless pressure of being a walking trust fund was permanently lifted, replaced by the effortless rhythm of a life lived entirely on my own terms. The routine of my new existence was deeply grounding, anchored by the simple, quiet rituals of the morning. I sat comfortably on the heavy timber porch overlooking the massive expanse of the lake, the water still completely calm before the wind picked up. I held a thick ceramic mug filled with strong black coffee. The bitter, robust flavor grounded me in the present moment, completely free from the artificial sweetness and imported luxury that had defined my previous life. I set the heavy mug down on the wooden railing and turned my hands over palms, facing the pale morning sky. I stared intently at the thick, rough skin, the deep scars mapping 40 years of brutal labor. These hands had mixed thousands of pounds of mortar. They had framed buildings in the freezing rain and gripped steering wheels during endless nights of exhaustion. For decades, I had utilized every ounce of their strength to build a secure empire for ungrateful hands to inherit. I had weaponized my own body to generate wealth for people who secretly wished I would die faster so they could spend it. Now, as I flexed my stiff fingers in the cold air, a profound realization washed over me. My hands were finally resting. They were no longer building fortresses for traitors or signing checks to subsidize entitlement. They were entirely, unconditionally my own. I used them to chop my own firewood, to steer my heavy utility truck, down the dirt roads and to guide the next generation of actual builders through the scholarship program. The labor was no longer a frantic, desperate sacrifice. It was a deliberate, joyful choice. The absolute stillness of the morning was interrupted by a sharp, singular vibration against the wooden table beside me. My secure cellular phone illuminated, breaking the dark surface of the screen with a brief text notification. It was a direct, encrypted dispatch from attorney Marcus Hayes. I picked up the device and read the concise update. Apex Horizon, LLC, had just officially finalized a massive, aggressive new commercial acquisition in the downtown sector. The meticulously planned transaction had executed flawlessly, effectively, doubling the total liquid value of my entire corporate empire overnight. The financial machine I had built was not just surviving without the parasitic drain of my former family. It was thriving with terrifying, unstoppable efficiency. The wealth continued to multiply, generating immense capital that would now be funneled directly into the Horizon Trade Scholarship to forge thousands of new, legitimate careers. I read the staggering financial figures on the glowing screen, but I felt no arrogance or boastful pride. I felt only the deep, resonating satisfaction of total victory. I gave a slight, genuine smile. I did not type a response to Hayes. He knew the parameters of his victory and required no further instruction. I simply set the phone face down on the timber table, silencing the corporate world entirely. I leaned back into my heavy wooden chair and looked out across the pristine water. The sun finally crested the distant tree line, casting a brilliant, blinding strike of gold across the surface of the lake. The cold shadows of the past were completely burned away by the rising light. The violent storm was over. The necessary brutal adjustment was officially complete. 2 months evaporated with the brutal, unforgiving speed of a sudden winter freeze. The absolute silence of my suburban estate stood in stark contrast to the chaotic descent of the people I had surgically removed from my life. The opulent fantasy world they had fiercely guarded shattered instantly, replaced by the relentless machinery of mere survival. David did not land softly on his feet. The corporate world is a remarkably small ecosystem, and the quiet, deliberate dismantling of his professional reputation ensured that no rival firm would touch him. Stripped of his executive title and the unearned prestige of my name, he faced the absolute reality of his actual capabilities. He was forced to accept a grueling position as a junior data entry clerk for a sprawling, soulless logistics company situated on the industrial outskirts of the city. The man who had previously occupied sprawling corner offices and dictated terms over catered lunches now sat hunched inside a cramped, windowless cubicle. Flickering fluorescent lights cast a sickly pallor over his face as he inputted endless lines of shipping manifests. He spent 10 grueling hours a day staring at a glowing monitor until his vision blurred and his back ached. His custom-tailored suits were replaced by stiff, uncomfortable slacks purchased from discount racks. He commuted on crowded public transit pressed shoulder to shoulder with the exact working-class individuals he had spent his entire adult life mocking. Every evening, he returned to a decaying rental unit with aching feet and a bruised ego trapped in the crushing monotony of menial labor. The arrogance that had fueled his attempt to lock me away was systematically crushed out of him by the sheer unyielding weight of earning his own living. The plunge into the working class struck Heather with an even more devastating ferocity. Deprived of her fraudulent boutique and her stolen luxury vehicles, she possessed absolutely zero marketable skills to fall back upon. Desperation drove her to the only sector that would accept her empty resume. She secured a minimum wage position at a discount retail outlet located in a dying suburban mall. Her days were entirely consumed by folding cheap synthetic garments, standing on unforgiving concrete floors for 8 uninterrupted hours, and enduring the sharp reprimands of a store manager half her age. The absolute pinnacle of her daily humiliation occurred whenever former acquaintances from her manufactured high society life wandered into the outlet searching for bargain deals. She was contractually obligated to plaster on a hollow corporate smile and scan the purchases of the exact same socialites she had previously dismissed over imported champagne at elite charity galas. They looked right through her, treating her with the identical dismissive contempt she had once directed at my domestic staff. She was learning the excruciating true cost of a single dollar the hard way, forced to calculate exactly how many hours of physical pain were required to afford basic groceries. Cynthia experienced an equally grim reality. Evicted from the luxury condominium my holding company owned, she found herself completely devoid of assets, savings, or sympathetic friends. Her ruthless pursuit of elite status had alienated everyone, leaving her entirely isolated when the financial foundation vanished. She currently resided in a cramped, unheated studio apartment, resting on the absolute edge of the city limits. The walls were paper-thin, and the antique radiator clicked incessantly, without producing any actual warmth to combat the rapidly falling temperatures. She spent her days wrapped in a heavy, moth-eaten blanket, staring blankly at the peeling paint on the ceiling, violently regretting the afternoon she had convinced her daughter to manipulate a wealthy widower. The artificial identities they had constructed around endless wealth were stripped away, exposing them to the freezing, uncompromising elements of the real world. Without the thick, insulating buffer of my money to artificially sustain their relationship, the marriage between David and Heather rapidly disintegrated into a highly toxic battleground. They had never genuinely loved each other in any meaningful capacity. Their union was a shallow transaction, a partnership of convenience built entirely on mutual greed and a shared desire for unearned status. Trapped together inside a tiny, drafty apartment, they turned their misery entirely upon each other. Their evenings were consumed by vicious, screaming arguments that echoed clearly through the thin drywall of their living quarters. Heather constantly blamed David for his monumental incompetence, shrieking that his sheer stupidity had cost them a multi-million-dollar empire and forced her into a life of retail servitude. She mocked his menial data entry position and openly despised his inability to provide the luxury she felt she intrinsically deserved. David retaliated with equal venom, aggressively reminding her that it was her insatiable, parasitic demands that drove him to embezzle from his mother's trust fund in the first place. He screamed that her vanity boutique and endless shopping sprees were the exact reasons he was currently dodging a federal prison sentence. They weaponized their shared failures, tearing at each other's insecurities with brutal precision. The lavish vacations and expensive dinners that had previously masked their complete lack of compatibility were gone, leaving them with nothing but raw, unfiltered resentment. They slept on opposite sides of a cheap, sagging mattress, united only by their mutual hatred and the crushing weight of their shared poverty. The quiet mornings were just as volatile as the nights filled with slammed doors and hostile silence. David realized that he was chained to a woman who only valued him for his proximity to my checking account. Heather understood that she was legally tethered to a man devoid of genuine ambition or capability. They had gambled their entire existence on a highly illegal scheme to declare me mentally incompetent, and losing that gamble had condemned them to a prison of their own making. The brutal reality of their situation escalated drastically as the harsh winter winds began to sweep violently through the city streets. The temperature plummeted overnight, turning their poorly insulated apartment into a freezing, miserable enclosure. David returned from another soul-crushing shift at the logistics company to find a thick official envelope resting inside their dented metal mailbox. He tore it open with freezing fingers, his breath pluming in the frigid hallway air. It was a final disconnection notice from the municipal utility company, detailing a massive overdue heating bill that he possessed absolutely no means to pay. The document stated in bold red ink that all services would be permanently severed within 48 hours if the balance was not settled in full. David stared at the threatening print, a cold panic seizing his chest. He looked at his bank account balance on his cracked cellular phone, seeing only double digits. He had no credit cards, no liquid assets, and no associates willing to loan him a single cent. He stood in the freezing corridor, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Desperation completely overrode his lingering shame. He convinced himself that 2 months of grueling punishment must have been enough to satisfy my need for retribution. He desperately wanted to believe that the passage of time had softened my resolve, that the biological tie between a father and a son would eventually override the memory of a profound betrayal. Shivering violently in the dim light, David pulled up my personal contact number on his screen. He pressed the call button, raising the phone to his ear, and listening to the electronic ringing, praying for a rescue he absolutely did not deserve. Reflecting on this entire ordeal, I have come to realize that the most dangerous lies we tell are the ones we tell ourselves out of love. For decades, I operated under the fundamental delusion that providing endless financial security was the ultimate expression of paternal devotion. I believed that by shielding my son from the harsh, unforgiving struggles I had endured during my own youth, I was guaranteeing his happiness and securing a stable future. I worked relentlessly, building a corporate empire with my bare hands, sacrificing my own peace of mind to ensure David would never know the bitter taste of poverty. But in my desperate attempt to pave his road with gold, I systematically denied him the opportunity to develop a spine. I confused enabling with nurturing. I thought I was protecting him from the world, but in reality, I was protecting him from the very friction required to build character, resilience, and honor. Wealth, when handed over without the prerequisite of hard work, does not liberate a person. It entirely corrupts them. It acts as a highly effective incubator for entitlement, breeding a toxic arrogance that eventually devours every shred of human decency. I watched my own flesh and blood transform into a parasite, entirely convinced that my assets were his inherent right. The realization that he viewed me not as a father to be loved, but as a biological ATM to be chemically decommissioned, was the most agonizing pain I have ever experienced. However, it was also the exact catalyst required to shatter my delusions. The ultimate lesson of this journey is that true love sometimes requires the fierce, uncompromising application of absolute boundaries. We are often taught that family is an unbreakable bond, a sacred covenant that must be preserved at all costs. Society dictates that we must endlessly forgive our relatives, absorbing their abuse and their toxicity simply because we share a genetic sequence. This is a fatal misconception. A bloodline is nothing more than a biological coincidence. It does not automatically grant someone the right to trample upon your dignity, siphon your resources, or threaten your mental and physical safety. Respect is the only legitimate currency of a genuine relationship, and when respect is permanently bankrupted, the relationship must be liquidated. Severing ties with David was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of profound preservation of the self. It taught me that my primary obligation is to protect my own soul. Dignity cannot be purchased with a trust fund, and it cannot be negotiated away to maintain a false sense of domestic harmony. You must fiercely guard your perimeter against any invader, even if that invader carries your last name. By cutting off the financial lifeblood that sustained his arrogance, I finally stopped participating in his moral decay. I forced him to step into the freezing arena of the real world, a world where actions carry heavy, undeniable consequences. Whether he learns from that brutal exposure or drowns in his own resentment is no longer my responsibility. My conscience is entirely clear. Furthermore, this experience forced me to entirely redefine the concept of legacy. We are conditioned to believe that our legacy is strictly biological, that passing our accumulated wealth to our offspring is the ultimate measure of a successful life. We blindly pour our resources into our children, hoping they will carry our name forward with honor. But what happens when the vessel is irreparably cracked? What happens when the heir is fundamentally unworthy? I discovered that true legacy is not inherited. It is actively built through the empowerment of those who actually possess the grit to appreciate it. Redirecting my fortune away from my ungrateful son and toward underprivileged youth was the most liberating decision of my professional career. I stopped funding endless luxury and started funding actual survival. I traded the hollow prestige of a family dynasty for the tangible impact of providing heavy machinery, certifications, engineering scholarships, and vocational training to individuals who knew the exact value of a single dollar. Seeing the hunger in their eyes, watching them grip a hammer or study a blueprint with fierce determination, I finally experienced the genuine pride of fatherhood. I became a mentor to a generation of builders forging a legacy written in steel concrete and the transformed lives of dedicated people. We must stop apologizing for demanding excellence and respect from the people occupying our inner circle. We must stop setting ourselves on fire merely to keep toxic family members warm. The moment you decide that your peace of mind is more valuable than maintaining a fraudulent family portrait, you reclaim your absolute power. The silence that follows the removal of toxic individuals is not a lonely silence. It is the brilliant, beautiful sound of freedom. It is the sound of a life finally lived on your own terms, unburdened by the parasitic demands of those who mistake your generosity for weakness. You are never too old to rewrite the terms of your own existence. You are never too entrenched in a situation to pull the plug and completely restructure your environment. The empire I built is now a tool for genuine elevation, no longer a trough for entitled leeches. The betrayals of the past have been completely neutralized by the unyielding enforcement of truth and consequence. I lost a biological son to the poison of unearned luxury, but I gained an entire army of legitimate heirs who will carry my vision forward through their own hard work. The storm has passed, the air is clear, and the foundation is permanently secured. The final adjustment is complete, and the remaining years are entirely unapologetically my own. We must all remember this fundamental truth as we navigate the complex landscape of family and fortune. True wealth is a quiet, untroubled mind, and true power is the absolute willingness to walk away from anyone who seeks to steal that rightful peace. Protect your legacy. Protect your unyielding soul. Forever. Share your thoughts on William's journey, and tell me how you would handle this situation in the comments below. Subscribe for more stories of truth and resilience.